The fundamental nature of a capitalist economy, as opposed to the other kinds of society that have existed in human history, is that the productive activities, which in all social systems have to be undertaken in order to alter nature in a way that produces the goods that a human population needs to survive. In this society are controlled and represented culturally by the system of money prices. This is a historical peculiarity. You have to remember that although money is a very old human institution, and you find various forms of it in many societies, this is the first society in history in which almost every good that is produced in society is produced in order to be exchanged for money, to be sold in a market. Productive activity doesn't appear as it did, for example, in many earlier social systems, simply as the human expenditure of energy, but is something which is performed in exchange for money. And unless you have money, therefore you can't get the things which you need in order to live. As my wife likes to tell our son, I have to go to work to get the money to buy the food. Now, why is this? What accounts for this peculiarity? This is the first society in history in which the people who actually do the producing do not own or otherwise control the various means, natural and socially constructed, that must be used in order to produce. People don't own land, they don't own factories, they don't own machines, they don't own raw materials. So the person who made this chair did not own the wood, did not own the lathe that the wood was turned on, did not own the stripping machine that made the cane, and so forth. This situation arose as the outcome of a long history in which other forms of the subordination of labor to a class of masters was supplanted by the capitalist form, in which labor has to be performed in return for a wage paid by the owner of what Marx and other socialists for the last 100 and 200 years have called the means of production. Because of this basic structure of the social system, that the production process is carried out by people who are unable to produce for themselves but must work for someone else in return for sums of money, which they then can use to buy back part of their product. The entire production system operates on the principle of the production of money in excess of the money invested by the owners of money in the production process. In other words, there is a small, and I mean literally, if you look at the world's population, a small group of people, a small class of people, who actually owns all the productive resources of the earth, which they hire other people to work on to produce goods, some of which they sell back to those people, some of which they sell to each other. The reason they do this is to accumulate the money, which is the symbol of the labor expended in the production process. If money cannot be made by producing goods, they will not be produced, on the one hand. On the other hand, since money is a symbol of human productive activity, the only way in which new money can be produced is if people produce the goods which have a symbolic equivalent in the form of money. Now, another feature of capitalism is that the owners of the production process, capitalists, do not operate as a unified group, but operate in competition with each other, striving to get as much as possible of the total amount of money that society has to spend on all the goods which that money is used to represent. Because of this peculiar combination of a competitive, privately owned system which produces for society at large, there has been a tendency since the very beginning of capitalism in the late 18th century, or actually since the beginning of capitalism in the 16th century, but this is the process which sped up very rapidly since the end of the 18th century, to substitute machine production for human labor. But since money is actually a symbol that represents human social activity, the actual human activity of production, as less and less human labor is involved in the production process, there is a tendency for less and less new labor to be involved in the production of goods, and therefore for less and less money to be made relative to the enormous amounts which are invested in raw materials, in means of production, in factories, in machinery, and so forth. This is I must imagine, almost a completely meaningless attempt to explain an extremely complicated phenomenon. But I see no easier way to do it, to tell you the truth.
No.
The interesting consequence of this is that a period of prosperity, by leading to economic growth, always seems to involve a replacement of human productive activity by mechanization, by machines, by the raising of the productivity of labor. That means that more raw materials have to be used and more machinery will be used. This leads to a smaller amount of human input to the production process relative to the money invested, which is experienced in capitalist terms as a decline in the rate of profit, in the new money made in response to investment. As profitability declines, that means there's, so to speak, actually less money available for reinvestment. At the same time, the scale on which money has to be invested becomes larger and larger. For the global capitalist system to continue to expand, the amount of monies required becomes extremely large. Now, there are various mechanisms which make it possible for money to be accumulated for the investment process. The stock market system, which allows people to pool money. The credit system through banking, which allows money which isn't being used at the moment to be borrowed and used. So money can be put together, and this is partly what made it possible for capitalism to expand for a very long time. But the continued expansion of the system requires gigantic amounts of investment. And as less is produced in the form of profit, there's less money available for continued expansion. That means that money stops being invested. That means that workers, the number of employed workers doesn't grow. That means that farmers can sell less food. That means that the producers of raw materials can sell less raw materials. You begin to have a decline in growth, and that is a process which feeds on itself, because in a period of expansion or in a period of growth, capitalists are always borrowing and assuming that the future will be like the past. And so they expand on the assumption of future profits. When those future profits don't materialize, everything contracts. And just as it expanded faster than it really should have, it contracts faster than it needs to, because all the credit, all the borrowing which was engaged in the past then gets, so to speak, burned up. Marx had the very clever idea, it was a deep insight, I think, to see that the process of depression itself could create the conditions for a new prosperity. Because what happens in a depression? It means that machinery, which has been constructed and purchased, suddenly can't be used. It loses its value. Companies go bankrupt. Buildings are sold. Land is sold. Machinery is sold at bargain prices. So a factory which cost $2 billion to build now is sold for $250 million. Labor which can't be employed loses its value. So labor becomes cheaper, less capital investment is required. So capital costs, the investment costs, the amount which capitalists have to invest to begin growing again, decreases relative to the amount of new value which the workers to be hired can create. So the curious fact about capitalism, which seems to explain the historical alternation of periods of prosperity and periods of depression, is that just as the period of prosperity, by putting downward pressure on profits, creates the basis for a depression, the depression, by lowering the cost of capital and labor, creates the basis for a new period of prosperity. This basically is what happened in the course of the 1930s, I believed. The Depression, which began formally in 1929, although actually it began much earlier, went on till after the Second World War. Really, I think the private capitalist economy did not really begin to operate again until the middle 1940s. So you had an extremely long period in which capital was destroyed, in which labor costs were lowered, and also one in which new and cheaper means of production were being produced. That made possible a post-war period of prosperity, which lasted for really a good 30 years, say from 1946 to mid-1970s. So that was an extremely high period of capitalist growth in all the Western nations, known by the economists fondly as the Golden Age. But like every previous period of prosperity, the prosperity itself put downward pressure on the rate of profit. Already by the 1960s, economists began to notice that profitability was falling. There were a number of very interesting studies in the mid-60s by economists trying to understand why profit rates were falling. And by the 1970s, that decline in profitability had led to a slowdown, a very radical slowdown in growth, which turned into a major economic collapse, which was prevented from turning into a classic 10 or 20-year depression by the deployment of gigantic quantities of government money.